When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject, 18 Streetlights. User, Picker-A8. Posted, June 10th, 1999.
However bad you think it might be to have your dad as the assistant principal at your high school, it's much worse. Forget getting away with anything. You're going to be so busy either having your ass kicked by every greaser who's ever been given detention or running away from the same that you won't have time to get into trouble. Because of all of this, when my dad was laid off from his job as a result of Massachusetts Proposition 2.5, I wasn't too busted up about it. Knowing now what a kick in the ass it is to lose a job and have to find another, I suppose I could have been more sympathetic to my old man, but hey, teenagers are assholes. Before I move on to the story of how our leaving Amherst nearly got me kidnapped by a black mist, there's one funny little bit I'd like to share. The details of Prop 2.5 aren't important aside from you knowing it was an across-the-board state cost-cutting measure. Amherst had initially proposed that to meet the new budget requirements, they would leave one vacancy each unfilled in the police and fire departments, lay off one assistant principal, one custodian, and finally, in what seemed like the oddest move possible, remove 180 streetlights. In the end, they did everything they promised, plus they fired another 8 municipal employees, but those streetlights, they stayed. Meaning, as I took great pleasure in telling my dad that his job had only been worth as much as 18 streetlights. Again, teenagers are assholes. Thankfully, my dad had a great reputation in the educational community, so within a month, he had found something new in Columbus, Ohio. Kids in the movies get all bent out of shape when their parents move them across the country away from their friends. Me? Because of all the ass beatings described above, I never really had any friends. Columbus was as good a place to be as any. Together, Mom, Dad, and me, and my sister Anna packed up the house, and a group of movers who looked like refrigerators with legs loaded it all into a moving van. They left in the morning, and soon after that, we piled into our station wagon along with our Cocker Spaniel Odie and started driving. Mom had never been one to enjoy car trips, so it was decided we'd cover the 12 hours to Columbus across 2 days, stopping overnight at roughly the halfway point outside Buffalo, New York. We got to the city in the late afternoon to early evening and arrived at our hotel downtown not long after that. I don't know what it's like these days, but in 1983, the recession had downtown Buffalo in rough shape, with storefront after storefront empty. Our hotel itself didn't look bad. In comparison to its surroundings, it looked practically palatial, but Mom was freaked out by the rough-looking men clustered together on street corners and in the shadows of empty buildings, so she made an executive decision and said we'd find something else out by the highway. After dinner at a Roy Rogers in a mall outside town, Dad made a few phone calls and found us a room at a chain hotel 10 minutes away. From the outside, it looked even nicer than the first one, which didn't even have a pool, and yet from the moment I laid eyes on it, something felt wrong. Gun to my head, I couldn't tell you exactly what that meant, except I knew I didn't want to sleep there. This wasn't something Dad had any interest in hearing, and we checked in as planned. Given what happened, it's better if I don't name the place exactly, but if you've ever been to a hotel in the Buffalo area where the pool atrium looks like the inside of a pirate ship, you'll know exactly the one I mean. The room was bigger than any of us expected, with 2 double beds spaced a good distance apart. My sense of unease persisted after checking in, hanging around through the swim that Anna and I took together. Despite the parking lot being full, she and I were the only 2 people in the pool, bobbing up and down in the shallow end like corks. I told her that something about the place didn't feel right to me, earning me the "sure, Gary, whatever you say" look I had come to know and love so well. She suggested that the Roy Rogers wasn't sitting right with me, and I had to pretend like a rogue hamburger somehow bringing about a rapidly spreading sense of doom wasn't the dumbest idea anyone had ever heard. That leaden feeling stayed right where it was, in the pit of my stomach, until I climbed into bed. As bad as the dread had been before going to sleep, it was even worse when I woke up in the night. I'd fallen asleep on my stomach with my left arm hanging over the edge of the bed, and I felt a sharp pain in the palm of my hand, followed by a tugging sensation. Odie would sometimes do this if he needed to use the bathroom, his little teeth digging into you just enough to know he meant business. The pressure on my palm increased the longer the pulling went on, and Odie was using more force than usual. I just thought to myself, he must really need to go, when one particularly violent tug pulled me clear out of bed. It was so sudden, I shouted some version of "what the fuck" as I hit the carpeted floor. Laying in a heap, I could still feel the needle-sharp ridges in my skin. I looked up to give Odie a piece of my mind, and instead saw something almost incomprehensible. Instead of my dog, I was facing what looked like a rolling black cloud, as if a million flies were silently swarming around each other in a column maybe 5 feet tall. My hand was inside the column, up to the wrist. The pressure, which still felt like a bite, increased, and I cried out in pain. That second cry woke up Anna, who always was the second lightest sleeper in the family outside of me. She was behind me, but her siren-like scream was enough of an indication that she was awake and seeing what I was seeing. Anna's shrieking woke our parents and probably everyone in the rooms on either side. Either Mom or Dad, I'm not sure who, put on one of the lamps, and for the briefest of seconds its light illuminated the column. Inside, you could see my hand, and just above that were 2 bright red eyes. A moment later, there was a terrible howl as Odie also became aware of the intruder. He wasn't a big dog, Odie, nor was he smart, but he had heart, and it sent him charging square at this black mist. He hadn't gotten within 2 feet of it before it sizzled out of existence, leaving behind the scent of ozone and what looked like bite marks in the skin of my hand. I wish there was some grand resolution to all this, but that was the end of the experience, at least as far as the unexplained goes. The other stuff, like my mother screaming and my father telling us we were leaving immediately, that was all easily explainable. We were scared out of our minds. The entire event, including our frenzied escape, had been over so fast that it only took half an hour of bleary-eyed highway driving for it all to seem like a half-remembered dream. The bite marks on my hand, which took almost a week to fade completely, were the only evidence we had to the contrary.
Subject, coming home. User, X3 Coastalt. Posted, January 29, 1997.
Brainerd police announced today that arson was to blame for last Friday's early morning fire at the Allstate Insurance Building, located 317 Washington Street. Police Chief Walter Beto told reporters that while details will be kept under wraps until investigators deliver their report early next week, the fire was unmistakably suspicious. Firefighters credit Friday's freak snowstorm with helping to contain the blaze. 10:15, and it's a little nippy here tonight in Garrison, with the mercury hovering around minus 10 degrees. If you're one of those diehard types out there fishing on Garrison Bay, remember to bundle up. I turned off the radio. My dad's old Farnsworth. It had been on the sill above the kitchen sink since I was a kid. Washing the last few suds down the drain, it suddenly occurred to me how stupid it was to have something electrical so close to water, and I wondered if it had occurred to my father at all. If it had, I thought, he'd probably left it there out of sheer bloody-mindedness. He was like that. The Friday before, when a blizzard had buried most of Crow Wing County in snow, the intractable son of a bitch had insisted on shoveling his own driveway instead of hiring someone. Ada Thorson, an iron-haired woman in her 50s who runs the Holiday Station store on Highway 180, found Dad the next morning face down and frozen solid. And so Buddy Kiefer finally lost the game of chicken he'd been playing with God for the better part of 70 years. When my half-sister Cheryl had called me in Oakland on Saturday to tell me about Dad's death, I don't think okay was the answer she expected. The quavering note in her voice firmed up fast, and in the tone angry fat women use when they're spoiling for a fight, she said, "You're coming to the funeral, right?" I'd last spoken to my father 10 years before at Mom's funeral. It called me a liberal queer, and I told him he was a worthless bigot prick and that the wrong person was in the box at the front of the church. As far as parting shots go, it wasn't Oscar Wilde, but it was enough to drop my father's jaw, something I'd never seen done. It felt like a victory at the time, but afterward, it was hard to remember that dropped jaw without also remembering the tears that had welled up in his eyes. I hadn't seen that before either. Those tears were the reason I traveled 2,000 miles to say goodbye and try and mend some fences with the family. After 3 days with my half-sister, I decided that there was a lot to say for broken fences. My 3-year-old nephew, Jason, chose that moment to speed into the kitchen, clad only in his Spider-Man underpants. From the living room, Cheryl whined, "Jason Thomas Horner, get back here right now," and when I walked to the doorway, I saw her standing, sweaty, next to the stairwell. She must have been trying to put him to bed. Seeing me, she put on her best, struggling Gold Star mother face and said, "Mike, he doesn't want to go to bed. Can you just scoop him up there? I'm worn right out." I bit my tongue before I could say that watching from the sofa as everyone else made funeral arrangements and kept house must have been exhausting. "Yeah, I'll get him," I said, retreating into the kitchen where Jason was huddled in front of the island. I crouched down. I'd only met him 3 days before, but already I liked the kid. He had spirit, and I think he liked me too. "Come on, big guy, it's bedtime." His brown eyes peeked out from under a shaggy mop of freshly washed blonde hair, and he said, "Too cold, Unc Mike." Couldn't argue with that. Sub-zero weather was a hell I'd almost managed to forget. "I'm cold too, big guy, but there are a lot of blankets around. Mommy'll make sure you stay warm, and I'll check on you later too." Whether that made sense to him or not, I don't know, but after pursing his lips for a minute, he said, "Okay, Unc Mike," and extended his arms, which was good enough for me. My back protested as I picked him up, but the heaviness of his head on my shoulder produced a contentment that negated any discomfort. As I carried him to his mother, he whispered in my ear, "Does the lake make you cold too?" The question puzzled me, and after Cheryl put Jason to bed, I asked her about it. "Oh, it's because of Dad," she said, in a tone that suggested I'd just asked the world's stupidest question. "He's been waking up at night talking about the lake. He knows Grandpa went to heaven at home, but he must have heard someone at daycare talking about the fishermen and gotten confused." Ice fishing was big business in Garrison, and after every year, at least half a dozen drunken sportsmen freeze to death on our lake, Mille Lacs, after wandering away from their shacks in the dark. As far as Cheryl was concerned, the conversation was over, and she turned her attention back toward the television. Soft California Constitution or no, I'd decided I'd rather be outside walking in minus 15-degree weather than sitting here with her or staring at the walls of my room. Outside, the streets were empty, and the crunch of snow underfoot was the only sound I could hear. In the silence, my mind picked over the events of the last week. Cheryl's phone call, the bumpy flight from Oakland, the waxy body at the funeral chapel that used to be my dad. I was so preoccupied that I didn't notice I'd arrived at the lake until I heard the creaking of the old boat launch. I followed the marina, a half-mile arc out over the lake. At the end, it opened into a wooden plaza dotted with several poorly made tool sheds, each casting oblong shadows. As kids, we joked that they were built by cross-eyed Polacks, but in the polar emptiness of that night, they weren't funny at all. In fact, just looking at them made me uncomfortable for reasons I couldn't explain. I turned away to my left where the steel gate leading down to the boat ramp hung open, its rusted bulk stirring slightly. At the bottom of the ramp was a boat launch similar in shape to the top of a pitchfork, each tine lined with tall wooden mooring poles. All were the same height and perfectly straight, yet from above I could have sworn they were bowing in to draw the eye toward the center platform. Carefully descending the icy wooden ramp, I had time to look at the latticework of timbers supporting the dock. In the moonlight, they took on the appearance of an enormous ribcage descending from the marina's spine. I was sorry I looked. Around the wharf, the water had gnarled into a thick skin of ice, and it looked like you could step right off the edge and walk forever into the frigid dark. I imagined my father in his Husqvarna jacket and red woolen cap, putting down his fishing rod and walking away until the blackness swallowed him. I shook my head. Jason was 3 and genuinely believed a rabbit brought him presents every Easter. No one expected him to have his facts straight. Middle-aged men are supposed to know better. A noise broke the stillness. It started out like a great yawn, then deepened to a rumble. The pitch of the noise increased, and I recognized it as the sound of cracking ice. The frozen crust surrounding the center platform was beginning to spiderweb. Feeling safe on my wooden perch, I edged closer to the rim of the wharf for a better look. The ice was buckling rather than splintering, like it was being pulled downwards into the lake. As the intensity of the noise increased, I felt the platform upon which I was standing begin to bend, and just as I thought I was to be pitched headlong into the rapidly disintegrating surface, the center platform broke free and sank into the lake, followed by the ice around it. Slowly, the gyre grew outwards, perfectly round and looking entirely too much like a frozen throat. I'd resolved to leave when the moss stopped growing only feet from where I stood, and curiosity trumped my fear. I knelt to inspect the hole. It was neither frozen nor fluid, but rather smooth and warm to the touch, like newly blown glass. The moon had gone behind the clouds, so it was impossible to see how far the pit went, but I could see at least 10 feet down before the light gave out. That didn't make any sense. The ice on any part of the lake couldn't be more than 1.5 feet deep at most, but there wasn't time to think about it because as quickly as one noise faded, another wet and pulsing took its place. I stood rooted to the spot, unable to flee. It wasn't until the clouds passed and the moonlight unveiled what was happening in the rift that my paralysis broke. A roiling black mass was swarming up toward the surface with grotesque agility, whether one creature or many, I couldn't tell. Reaching the boat ramp, I heard the things crash onto the wharf where only a moment before I had stood. The noise they made was that of roadkill being dragged into a ditch, burst entrails scraping on concrete. Near mad with terror, I slipped as I began my ascent and heard them gain ground. The horrible slaughterhouse noise seemed only feet away as I regained my footing and scrambled up the boat ramp past the rusted gate. The unusual shadows of the tool sheds seemed to reach for me across the plaza like sentries eager to regain their master's prize. For the first time in my life, I prayed. As I ran, I begged God to keep me safe. From the ice, I heard a guttural churning noise that rose and fell with my internal pleadings. The beasts were mocking my unspoken prayers. No matter how hard I ran, the creatures gathered, and the hazy lights of the shore came no closer. My last thought before being overcome was of Jason. As the light faded and I was sucked into an icy, fibrous mass that quivered with awful vitality, I heard his voice whispering, "Does the lake make you cold too?" Two fishermen found me unconscious and hyperthermic in the center of Mille Lacs, miles from both the shore and marina. The doctors at St. John's told me that aside from a coin-sized patch on the back of my neck, I had escaped frostbite. They called it a medical miracle, and I didn't correct them. They also said that I must have become disoriented by the cold and walked away from the shore. I didn't correct them on that either. When I was well enough, I left the hospital and went straight home to Oakland, missing my father's funeral. The angry answering machine messages from Cheryl thinned out after a few weeks, and though I felt bad for leaving Jason, I couldn't go back to Garrison. The gap in my memory between being taken and being found is never filled in, but when the temperature drops, I start to shake, and faintly I hear a wet, pulsing sound inaudible to everyone else. Winter is about to return, and as the 1-year anniversary of that night approaches, the frostbite scar on my neck has begun to tingle. It has to be coincidence. It has to be.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.